for all that we do on this planet, but which doesn't any longer elicit that kind of concern or expressions of alarm on both sides of the aisle or from that many senators. And the two words that have described this particular issue over a long period of time now have actually become somewhat words of almost skepticism in many quarters in America, or a kind of shrug. I don't know what I can do about it. It's not something that I ought to really worry about. Someone else is going to take care of it, or maybe it isn't real. And the words are climate change. Climate change over the last few years has regrettably lost credibility in the eyes and ears of the American people because of a concerted campaign of disinformation, a concerted campaign to brand the concept as somehow slightly outside of the mainstream of American political thinking. I have to say it's been a remarkably effective campaign. You can't sit here and say it hasn't worked. Every opportunity to cast a pall on facts with some kind of cockamamie theory has been taken advantage of, and a lot of money has been spent, Mr. President. A lot of money has been spent in this process of disinformation and of discrediting. The truth is that, people used to joke years and years ago about those who argued that the earth was flat. And for a long period of time, people argued that the earth was flat, even when the evidence of astronomers and others and explorers evidenced that it was in fact quite the opposite. And so we have, in effect, with respect to climate change in America today, what is fundamentally a flat earth caucus. A bunch of people, some of them in the United States Congress itself, who still argue against all the science, all the evidence. They argue that somehow we don't know enough about climate change, or they argue that the evidence isn't sufficient, or they argue that it just is a hoax. I mean, we have members of the United States Senate who argue that it is a hoax. But that's all they do. They make the argument that it's a hoax, but they don't present and can't present any real evidence, hard, scientific, peer-reviewed evidence to the effect that it is, in fact, a hoax. And, Mr. President, the reason they can't is there are 6,000 plus peer-reviewed studies, which is the way science has always been done in America. If you are a scientist and you're a researcher, you do your science, you do your research, and then your analysis is put to the test by your peers in those particular disciplines. And they pass on the methodology, the pedagogy by which you arrived at the conclusions you arrived at. So you have more than 6,000 of those kinds of properly peer-reviewed analyses of the science of climate change. And you have, Mr. President, on the other side of the ledger, not one, zero peer-reviewed analyses that say human beings aren't doing this to the atmosphere and that humans are not contributing or the main cause of what is happening in terms of the warming of the surface of the earth. Now, what's happened is in America, we all know it. We're seeing it in campaigns. Because of Citizens United, you have these unfathomable amounts of money being thrown into the political system. Millionaires and billionaires who plunk down millions of dollars, $10 million check at a whack, $20 million. And then what's happening is people buy their facts. They create their facts out of whole cloth. And as we all have been reminded so many times in the last year, certainly, because of this new debate we're having in America, as our colleague that I was privileged to serve with here, Pat Moynihan, reminded us again and again, everyone is entitled to their own opinion in America, but you're not entitled to your own facts. But in fact, in American politics today, that's not true. You are entitled, apparently, because you can go out and buy them. You buy some scientist who you give him some, appropriate amount of funds. He goes out and does a study with a particular conclusion that has to be found, and they produce a whole bunch of hurly-burly to surround it and suggest that those are in fact facts. And the result of this is that over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've had this concerted assault on reason and assault on science. And this isn't the first time in the history of humankind we've been through these things. I mean, Galileo was put on trial for his findings. And as we all know, there have been countless periods of times. I mean, that's why we went through an age of enlightenment, an age of reason, as people challenged these old precepts that weren't based on fact, but just sort of raw belief and or political interest in some cases, or religious interest in some cases. A handful of senators here, Senator Boxer, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Sanders, Senator Lautenberg, the chair, and Senator Franken have recently spoken out about this very process by which an incredibly important, legitimate issue of concern to all Americans, to everybody in the world, is being completely sidelined because of the status quo interests of powerful corporations and other interests in America that just don't want to change, or some of whom find political advantage in somehow buying into the theory, discrediting it. This has not been an issue on which there is a profile of courage by some in the United States Congress who are prepared to stand up and say what they know is true, but what has become far more convenient to avoid. I believe the situation that we face, Mr. President, is as dangerous as any of the sort of real crises that we talk about today. We had a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee on the subject of Syria. And we all know what's happening with respect to Iran and nuclear weapons and the possibility even of a war. Well, this issue actually is of as significant a level of importance because it affects life itself on the planet, because it affects ecosystems on which the oceans and land depend for the relationship of the warmth of our earth and the amount of moisture that there is and all of the interactions that occur as a consequence of our climate. It involves our health because of policies that we do or don't choose to pursue with respect to pollution in the air. Pollution didn't used to be a question mark in American politics. We fought that fight in the 1970s and 60s. Rachel Carson started this enormous movement for reasonableness when she warned Americans that they were living next to toxic wells and to water that had been polluted by companies that put mercury or other poisons into the earth that went down into the water supply, and people got cancer and people died. And America decided in the early 1970s, with the first Earth Day in 1970 itself, and then the actions that Congress took after that in response to the American people, everybody decided we don't want that pollution in the air. We actually passed legislation in 1972 and 3 and 4 that created the EPA. America didn't even have an Environmental Protection Agency until Americans said we want to be protected. And people in Congress responded to that. We passed the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection, Coastal Zone Management. All of these things came about because of an awareness among the American people that they wanted to live differently and make a different set of choices, or have their politicians make a different set of choices on their behalf. Now suddenly, there's an assault on the EPA, on the Clean Air Act. All of a sudden, pollution doesn't matter. And that's what we're talking about. Greenhouse gases are, in fact, a pollutant. And the particulates that come with it are particulates that have the same effect on human beings in terms of their breathing, their lungs, the input to some of their food, their water, that ultimately has an impact on cancer, on emphysema, on other diseases that come as a consequence of the quality of air that you breathe. And yet we've got this whole notion now that somehow we've gone too far, that we've done enough, or that the job has been done and we can all go home, when in fact it is exactly the opposite. So with respect to pollution, there are choices here. With respect to health, the single greatest cause of young Americans going to the hospital in the summertime and costing billions of dollars to the American people is environmentally induced asthma. And that environmentally induced asthma comes about as a consequence of the ingredients that go into the air. So all of this is related. In addition, there's one person in the United States Senate who doesn't know that we are still more dependent than we want to be. We're better than we were. We've made improvements, but we're still more dependent than we want to be on foreign oil. We could be doing far better and more effectively, Mr. President, with respect to that dependency if we pursued an intelligent energy policy. We still don't have an energy policy after the years we've been talking here in the Senate and elsewhere about doing it. And why is that important to this issue of climate change? Because energy policy is the solution to the problem of climate change. If you have an effective energy policy, then you are dealing not only with your independence issues, but you're dealing with the sources of carbon and other greenhouse gases that are causing the problem today. Now, 20 years ago, this year, Mr. President, I was privileged to go with a senator from New Jersey over there, Senator Lautenberg, Senator John Chafee, Senator Al Gore, Senator Wirth, and others. We went down to Rio, where we took part in the First Earth Summit, which President George Herbert Walker Bush took seriously. To the great credit of President George H.W. Bush, he not only sent a delegation down there, he went down there himself and he spoke about the issue. And he helped to embrace a forward-leaning, I think 160-some nations signed on to an agreement to try to restrain greenhouse gases. That was back in 1990. Incredible, Mr. President, 1992. And here we are 20 years later. We couldn't even get the time for the Senate to send a delegation down there, let alone enough people who thought it was really important and of interest. And the Earth Summit, 20 years later, came and went without any major step forward or progress, and the procrastination continues. Mr. President, today, I remember the debate when we came back from Kyoto, 1998 or so, and we had a debate in the Senate about whether or not the United States should take part in the Kyoto Treaty, which we now all know is a long history that we didn't and wouldn't, because it was viewed as being too unilateral. And in fact, everybody had a question mark about, well, what about China? We can't possibly sign up to this because China won't do it, and they'll go racing ahead of us and continue to grow their economy at the expense of the United States. Well, Mr. President, guess what? Today, China is the leading energy producer, clean energy producer in the world? China. The United States of America invented the technologies 50 years ago of solar and wind, renewable energy technologies, turbines, the transmission and so forth, and photovoltaics. Well, about 4 years ago, China had about 9% of the market, 4 years ago. 2 years ago, China had 40% of the market. And today, China has over 70% of the global solar market, and the United States, which invented the technology, doesn't have one company in the top 10 solar panel producers, solar energy producers of the world. And you know what's happening, Mr. President? 95% of what China produces, it exports to other countries, including the United States of America. So here we are, we give up our lead, we don't get the jobs, everybody's screaming about jobs. The energy market is a $6 trillion market with about 6 billion users. Just to put that in a perspective, the market that created the great wealth of the 1990s in the United States was in fact a $1 trillion market with about 1 billion users, called the technology market. We saw it with personal computers and with the rest of the telephone communications technology of the 1990s. We didn't even have an internet in the United States until about 1995, 96 that began to be commercialized. And in that short span of time, we created more wealth in America than we had ever created at any time in America's history. We created 23 million new jobs because we led in that new industry. Here we are today staring at the potential of this extraordinary industry, which is the energy market, and we are just sitting on our heels while other countries take it and run with it and grow their economies, and we're sitting around trying to say, where are the jobs? It's an insult. It's an insult to our intelligence. It's an insult to every American's aspirations about where they'd like to see our country go. And the fact is that not just China, but India, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, countless other countries are taking greater advantage of this than the United States. And one of the principal reasons that we have trouble getting that market moving is we refuse to put the real price on the price of carbon. Carbon has a price. Everything that we're doing to our country and to our marketplace, to our communities today as a result of pollution is a price we're going to pay. But that price is not subsumed into the price of products, the price of doing business, or anything else, because we just avoid it altogether. So a lot of people continue, unfortunately, here to avoid the science and just not to deal with the reality of what is happening. Well, yesterday, 2 days ago, Mr. President, in the New York Times, there was a very important op-ed that appeared. And it was written by a well-known climate skeptic, Dr. Richard Muller, a professor of physics at the University of California in Berkeley. And he has written many times about how he did not believe that the science was adequate or had produced it. Let me read his words. This is Dr. Muller. Call me a converted skeptic. 3 years ago, I identified problems in the previous climate studies that, in my mind, threw doubt on the very existence of global warming. Last year, following an intensive research effort involving a dozen scientists, I concluded that global warming was real and that the prior estimates of the rate of warming were correct. I am now going a step further. Humans are almost entirely the cause. That's what this former climate skeptic has said. Bottom line, we need to be armed with the facts, not with empty rhetoric, and that's exactly what Dr. Muller set out to do. Let me quote him. We carefully studied issues raised by skeptics. Biases from urban heating. We duplicated our results using rural data alone. From data collection, Prior groups selected fewer than 20% of the available temperature stations. We used virtually 100%. From poor station quality, we separately analyzed good stations and poor ones. And from human intervention and data adjustment, our work is completely automated and hands-off. In our papers, we demonstrate that none of these potentially troublesome effects unduly biased our conclusions. Now, obviously, we all know the future has a hard way of humbling people who try to predict it too precisely. But I have to tell you, Mr. President, when the science is screaming at you pretty consistently over a period of 20 years, and not just screaming at us to say that it's coming back correctly, but it's coming back with faster results in greater amounts than the scientists predicted, as a matter of human precaution, that ought to be an alarm bell, and people ought to take note. Here's what Dr. Mueller says again. What about the future? As carbon dioxide emissions increase, the temperature should continue to rise. I expect the rate of warming to proceed at a steady pace, about 1.5 degrees over land in the next 50 years, less if the oceans are included. But then he says ominously, but if China continues its rapid economic growth, and I say as a matter of parentheses, who doesn't believe China isn't going to do everything in its power to continue its growth path and do what it's doing? So he says, if China continues its rapid economic growth, it has averaged 10% per year over the last 20 years, and its vast use of coal, it typically adds 1 new gigawatt per month. Then that same warming could take place in less than 20 years. Less than 20 years, folks. In North Carolina recently, state senators actually voted not to do any planning for the potential of sea level rise, even though scientists today tell you the sea level is rising. Ask insurance companies about what they're thinking about their potential exposure and liabilities as you look down the road with respect to the disasters that could come as a consequence of these changes. So the plain fact is that despite all of the evidence, and I'm not going to go through all of it right now, but it is there for colleagues to analyze. Countless studies of what's happening in terms of movement of forests, literally movement, as it migrates. Species that have left Yellowstone National Park and migrated north. Talk to the park rangers. Talk to the folks in Canada and in Colorado and Montana and places about the millions of acres of pine trees that have been destroyed by the pine bark beetle that now doesn't die off because it doesn't get as cold as it used to. Talk to people in Canada and in the north of the United States who used to skate on ponds that used to freeze over that don't freeze over anymore. I mean, there are hundreds of examples. Talk to the Audubon Society. Ask them about the reports of their members about certain plants and shrubs and trees and things that don't grow in the same places that they used to. There's a 100-mile swath in the United States now where there's been a migration of things that grow and don't grow. This is going to have a profound impact on agriculture in our country as we go forward if it continues. And I just share with my colleagues why that is true beyond any scientific doubt. The first scientist who actually wrote something about global climate change was a Swedish scientist by the name of Arrhenius, and he wrote around the turn of the 19th century, 1890-something. I don't remember the year, but he's the guy who first said there's this relationship to the gases that are trapped in the atmosphere and this thing called the greenhouse effect. And in fact, science has now determined to a certainty, Mr. President, that the reason we can breathe here on Earth today, the reason it's warm enough for us to live, the reason life itself exists on Earth is because there is a greenhouse effect. And it is called a greenhouse effect because it behaves just like a greenhouse. The light comes comes down from the sun at a very direct angle, and on many things on Earth it is reflected, like the ice and snow and off roofs and parking lots and other things. But in the ocean and in certain other dark spots, it's subsumed into that mass, and it goes back much more opaque than it comes down in its directness. And the reason, therefore, for the greenhouse gas is that it doesn't escape. It doesn't break out of the thin veneer of the atmosphere that contains the gases that creates the greenhouse effect, which actually creates an average temperature globally of about 57 degrees Fahrenheit. That's why life can exist, because we have a greenhouse effect. And it stands to absolute high school, if not elementary, middle school logic, that if certain amount of gases are contained, and there's always been a balance of some degree, that if you add to it massively and thicken the amount that is there, less heat is going to escape, and you wind up augmenting that effect of the greenhouse. Now that, scientists tell us, I'm not a scientist, but I learned how to listen to them, at least read it and try to think about it. The scientists tell us that in order to keep the temperature of the Earth somewhere near where it is today or within the permissible range of change, you have to keep your greenhouse gases, originally they said at 450 parts per million. Then as they noticed the damage and did more calculation, they came down and said, no, 350 parts per million. Why is this important? Because today, Mr. President, as we are here assembled in the Senate, we are now at 397 parts per million. We're above where they say you have to hold it. And worse, without doing anything, which we're not doing, we're only adding the amounts. We're moving at a rate that will take it up to 500 or 600 parts per million. And if that happens, you will be at a tipping point with respect to the amount of temperature change, 5 to 7 degrees, and nobody can predict with certainty what happens, except that we know that the ice already melting in Greenland and in the Arctic will melt faster and disappear. As more water is exposed, that dark water subsumes more of the heat. The heat creates greater, more rapid melting. And that's exactly what scientists are seeing in the Arctic and Antarctic today, where whole blocks of ice, the size of the state of Rhode Island, have broken off and dropped into the sea and floated south to melt. Now, Mr. President, there are dozens of other examples of what has happened. I said I wouldn't go into all of them today. I just say to my colleagues, please read and challenge the science. Talk to the people who are the peer reviewers of these analyses, because we have a responsibility here to future generations, and to all of us, to try to get this right. And I have to tell you, Mr. President, in the balance of right and wrong here, I don't understand the judgment some people are making. We know this is a $6 trillion market, as I mentioned. We know that if we were to price carbon, the marketplace would move rapidly towards the kinds of technologies and new job creation that would respond to that pricing. And the United States could become a seller of these technologies and a builder of these new energy capacities in various parts of the world. Astonishingly, the United States of America doesn't even have an energy grid. The East Coast has an energy grid. The West Coast has an energy grid. Texas has its own energy grid. And from Chicago out to the Dakotas, there's a line of a sort of an energy grid. But the entire center of the United States is just a great big gaping hole where you don't have any connected energy transmission capacity. And the result is we can't produce renewable energy down in the four corners of the Southwest, in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and so forth, and sell it to Minnesota in the wintertime, or to New England, where we pay a very high price for energy. We can't send energy from one part to the other in the United States of America. It's an insult. We need to build a national energy grid. And in the building of that grid, there are countless jobs to be created for Americans, countless technologies to be developed. For every $1 billion we spend on infrastructure, you put 27,000 to 35,000 people to work. If we passed our infrastructure bank effort here in the Senate, for $10 billion of American taxpayer leverage, we could have $650 to $700 billion of infrastructure investment paid for by Chinese investment, by Arab Emirates investment. Wouldn't cost the American taxpayer a dime to be building America and putting people to work, and we're not doing it, and not even building out the energy grid of our nation. So, Mr. President, I hope in the end, I'll wrap up here, but I must say to my colleagues, the avoidance here of responsibility for a whole host of choices that we ought to be making. And obviously, yes, it begins, as I said earlier, with the deficit and the debt, and we can deal with those issues. There isn't a person in the Senate who doesn't understand what the magic formula is going to be to do that. But everybody wants to wait till the end of the election. I got it. But this issue has been waiting and waiting and waiting for 20 years now, while other countries are stealing our opportunities to be able to be in the marketplace and be winning. And nothing screams at us more than the need to have an energy policy for our country that begins to address the realities of climate change, and nothing screams at us more than to tell the truth to the American people about climate change, to stop having it be an unusable word in American politics, and not to allow it to become a source of attack and ridicule with non-facts and a bunch of cockamamie theories that have no foundation in science or in the kind of analysis that does this institution justice. And I hope over the course of the next months we can have this fight, because nothing less than our economic future, which is in the end our greatest strength for our military, for our security, for all of our objectives. That's what's at stake in this effort. And I hope we will finally wind up doing what is right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, before the senior senator from Massachusetts leaves the floor, I want to commend him for his constant leadership in matters of the better environment, better, more effective ways to get our energy without spoiling the environment and putting what amounts to toxics in the air. And I congratulate him for his constant leadership in this area. Mr. President, one thing that Democrats and